Genesis chapter 1. We're actually in day 4. I was looking ahead at day 5 next week. So if you're going along with us, you're like, dude, he skipped a day. Verse 14, I'm not going to skip. God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. Well, if you have been with us, we've mentioned this a few times, and the same is true today. There is controversy that surrounds day 4 of creation solely because of the relation it does or it doesn't have with day 1 of creation. If you look at verse 3 of Genesis 1, it says, "Let there be light." God said that, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening and there was morning the first day. And then you're like, well, hold up. Here in day 4, down in verse 14, all of a sudden now there's lights to separate day and night. So if people argue back and forth about what's actually going on here, is there contradictions here? How could this even be possible? Would there be this massive gap that would indicate why there was light on the first day but not actually light generators until the 4th day? And I'm going to try to keep this fairly simple for you. And I hope that when we keep things simple as we're going through the creation narrative, it doesn't seem like a cop-out, but it seems like us basically placing faith in the fact that we believe that what is said here is the truth. And that I don't necessarily feel that it is in the flow of what God has to answer every single objection and to try to sound like the smarter person, when it comes to different scientific arguments. I'm simply coming to you as someone who says, I believe what's here, and I believe that it's written simply for a reason, and I believe that if you can get past chapter 1, verse 1, you can believe mostly anything else you read after that. So if we can see this with faith and see, okay, there actually might be some good answers here, but they're simple answers, and take that for what it's worth, it's going to be a lot more life-giving to you to believe that God made the world than a big hurdle that you have to get over because everybody else doesn't believe that God made the world. Does that make sense? So here's the simple play. I believe that the answer for us in the difference between day 1 and day 4, or how it relates, comes from the context of the whole chapter. If you look, verse 14 says that the purpose of the sun and the moon and the stars throughout our passage is to separate the day from the night, to serve as signs to mark sacred times, and to serve as signs for days and years. And then as we read in verses 3 through 5, what does that tell us about the universe on day 1? That there was light, that there was darkness, and that God separated the two by his own word and his creative power. Both light on day 1 and the light generators on day 4 have the same purpose. They're just phrased in 2 different ways. They actually both do the same thing. Day 1, separate the light from the darkness. That's in verses 4 and 5. And God calls that day and night. In day 4, in verses 17 through 18, he separates the light from the darkness and calls them governing agents of the day and the night. So you have the same thing happening on both days, but God simply places markers that we can see as people to show when day and night have been separated. It doesn't mean that they weren't separated at first, It doesn't mean that it took until the fourth for the separation to happen. It means that it was already taking place, and what we see in day 4 is God placing things in the sky so we know how to mark when those days and nights flip and switch. So I agree with Henry Morris when he says light rays were impinging on the earth as it rotated on its axis during the first 3 days of essentially the same intensities and directions as those which would later emanate from the heavenly bodies to be emplaced on the 4th day. It's a really long-winded way to say light was coming during the day as though from the sun, and during the night as though from the moon and the stars, even though they had not yet been made. Simple. He's saying it was already happening. As the earth was rotating through day 1, day 2, day 3, those first 3 days, there was light coming through, and then there was night, and then there was light coming through again, and then there was night, and then there was light coming through again. You see where I'm getting at? But there just was no physical marker of how that was happening. It just was happening. So the question arises, why create the sun, the moon, and the stars if light and dark are already separated and they already work within the Earth's rotation on day 1? That's everybody's hang up. Okay, fine. If it's happening on day 1, why would he make all these things on day 4? Because it seems to be unnecessary. So I want to get some answers to that question directly from Scripture, and then we're going to move from there into what it might mean for us today with some stuff that we can talk about in our groups. There's one guy that I like to read sometimes, not all the time, on Genesis. His name's Derek Kidner. And Derek Kidner, he's a scholar, and he makes the reasoning for the sun, moon, and the stars very plain for people to understand. So I basically took what he has and I put it on some slides for us to write down and think about. The sun, the moon, and the stars are God's good gifts for, number 1, producing the pattern of varied seasons. The NIV translates that sacred times. And those patterns of seasons are the things in which we thrive as humans. So why would he put the sun, moon, the stars up in the sky? Because it marks out the different seasons we go through as people. And Acts chapter 14 talks about that. He has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. This was a sermon pulled out of the book of Acts where the case is being made simply because time rotates for you. And you experience seasons, you experience rain, you experience growth, you're able to do work, you're able to have things. That proves that God has been providing for you your whole life. You were born into a system in the world that was made for human flourishing. And when someone's given a sermon, they point to that as a fact that God has then placed a testimony of his existence just because you've made it through fall, winter, spring, and summer. It's kind of cool, actually. So why sun, moon, and stars? Well, produce the pattern of seasons by which we thrive. Second, because Israel was supposed to mark out their year for God. You have Leviticus 23, verse 4. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins, here it is, at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. You don't even know when to do the feast that God requires you to do as his people if you don't have twilight. Or if you don't know that as days progress, months progress, so you know what the 14th day of the month is at twilight, so you can initiate the Passover feast. All of that is inside of creation. He goes on the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present a food offering to the Lord. And on the seventh day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. Israel had to mark out their year by festivals and feasts in order to honor God who chose them as his people. And they would not be able to do that if they didn't have the sun, the moon, and the stars to dictate to them when a day starts, when a day ends, when they're moving to the next thing, when this happens, when it's the 14th day, when it's the 15th day. So why would you put it there? So that God knew my people are going to need these things to mark out when to honor me with the things that I'm asking them to do. And lastly, the sun, the moon, and the stars are God's good gifts to be signs for and pointing to him, and not pointing to fate. Because it says in our passage that they only govern as light bearers. They are not considered powers, which is actually probably a lot more important than you might realize. With astrology, and especially in the ancient time when they would worship sun gods, moon gods, it's important that God actually puts them in after light and darkness are separated, because he's simply saying, I'm placing them there just so you can mark out what I've already done. I'm not placing them there so that you can look at them as powerful beings and that the fate of what they reveal determines your life. He would even go on to say in Jeremiah through the prophet, do not learn the ways of the nations or be terrified by signs in the heavens, though the nations are terrified by them. He's literally saying, don't be like the other nations that when certain things happen in the sky, like a blood moon, or certain things with the sun, or an eclipse, they freak out like there's a deity up there upset with them. And he's saying, don't look at those anomalies in the sky and think, oh no. They're just there to govern the light and to show you when the night or the day is passing forth. And if you know Jeremiah chapter 10, he then goes into this long discourse about the worthlessness of idolatry. So people would view the sun, the moon, and the stars as powers and deities, but God would say they are simply signs that point to him. If you have a Bible, you can quickly flip over to Luke chapter 21, and then I will move on from this point. But I thought this was worth a read, especially with the days we live in. I may be a millennial, but I believe in the rapture, and I believe in the end times, so I'm all for it. Luke 21, in verse 25, Jesus speaking says that there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies, that's sun, moon, and stars, will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. That's what I'm talking about. He says, yes, in the end times, this is Jesus. In the end times, wild things will happen in the sky. The heavenly bodies will shake. Sun, moon, and stars are going to do things you never seen them do before. And he's like, and people are going to lose their stuff. Because they're just going to be like, this is every wrong movie I've ever watched happening in real life. Thinking that the sun, the moon, and the stars are mad at them and they're coming down to do that stuff. But look at how Jesus turns that into an avenue of hope for people that are rooted in him. He's like, but the other thing you're going to notice as the sun, the moon, and the stars start doing wild stuff in the end is that I'm coming through them. And there's going to be a cloud where all of a sudden you see me burst right through that thing. And he goes, when all that starts to happen, lift up your head and be very excited. Because that means your redemption. That's right, your redemption's on the way. Your redemption's on the way. The signs of the times that sometimes can make us nervous or afraid or scared or wonder or think, did we get it right? Is it all falling apart? I hope this thing is real. Right? I could stand up here and say, fine, I feel that way. Jesus says when all that stuff starts to happen, it's literally stretch out your neck and look. Because as all that starts going crazy, I'm almost here. So cool. That's why he put the sun, the moon, and the stars up there. Not so we can worship them, but so that on a blessing side and on maybe a more fearful in the natural side, it can point to him one way or the other. So I agree with one scholar. His name is John Sailhammer. He has this paraphrase of our section. It says, so God, not anyone else, made the lights and put them into the sky. That's the reason why it's there on day 4. So that way when all of the stuff starts happening in the sky, you realize, well, God put them there. So clearly he's controlling them to communicate something. Or when you look up into the sky, you don't think, I wonder if there is a sun god or life on other planets or a moon god. But that you would think God put the God of the universe, the only one who exists, put those there. And he put them there for my blessing, so that as seasons go, I thrive. And he put them there as signs to me so that when they start to do things, I realize he's pulling those strings to communicate to us something specific about himself, not about the lights themselves. So Nehemiah chapter 9 lays it out very simply. You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all their starry host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you. Worship of God, not creation, should be our response when we experience the blessing of times, seasons, and years that are marked out by the cycle of the sun, the moon, and the stars. When seasons change in your life and they progress forward and you're still breathing and God is still working, that is not so that you can then worship the creation as if the creation itself is doing something for you as a power. It's meant to have you worship God because you realize he placed all of these things in the sky so that I could actually live, and not just lived, but I could thrive. And I could know times, I could know years, I could know dates, I can know if he wants me to do something on a certain day, I can know that it's Sunday and we should come together, I can know that it's small group night and we should come together, I can know all kinds of things that enhance your life. And you're supposed to have that mindset and then worship him as you experience those things. So here's another one. John chapter 12. Jesus cried out, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. I've come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness." Jesus himself compares and uses an analogy and a picture of himself as a light that portrays a deeper reality. That's, I came from the Father. And if you believe in me, then you believe in the Father. And if he accepts you because he accepts me, well, now you're in the family of God. In the same way that you view those things in creation and it's supposed to speak of something deeper, Jesus even speaks of a deeper reality by his life. And then he turns the tables through Paul in 2 Corinthians. We all, who with unveiled faces reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So not only is Jesus setting this precedent, now we as his followers and image bearers are supposed to reflect something else that's deeper than our own surface existence. We're supposed to reflect that we've seen Jesus to everybody else. So, in the same way that the sun, the moon, and the stars deliver light that existed before they did, so we are to live in a way that reflects light that was in existence before we were made. The sun, the moon, and the stars simply are agents that are working for God to communicate what's been true since day one, which is there's light, there's darkness, and he separates the two. Our lives are supposed to be something that communicates we were born in sin, we were living in darkness, we saw the light that was separated in us, and now we reflect what has been true from the very beginning, which is light has come into the world. And it came into the world in a man named Jesus, who happened to be the Son of God. I'm supposed to communicate that somehow, just by living. That's what Paul's saying. That's what the sun, the moon, and the stars communicate to us. So, I'll leave you with this one. There was, at that time, meaning day 4, nothing on any of the stars, planets, satellites, or any other heavenly body that was out of place or indicative of conflict or catastrophe in any way. At that moment, when the sun, the moon, and the stars were placed, there was no chaos. There was nothing that was out of order. Everything worked exactly as it should because everything reflected exactly what it was supposed to. Everything was listening and obeying the word of God, which was sun to govern the day, moon to govern the night, and the stars. Those only exist because God said exist. They only do what they do because God said, this is what you do. And in the same way, if all of creation, ourselves included, reflected the light as it was designed to do, the world would be in order. If it was true then it's true now. That if those of us who are bearing the image of God would simply reflect that fact, the world would line up into order. Because we're communicating a truth that goes beyond when we were made, something that is ancient and something that brings life to people when they come in contact with it. And so, controversy between the two, I really think that it's as simple as God just saying, human beings are going to need to mark out exactly when day and night are moving and what day is what night is what. So I'm going to put these things in there to be beacons and markers so that they can thrive. And that maybe as they thrive, they'll realize there's a lot of intelligent design just in my 24-hour period of living each day. That it would be a testimony, in Paul's words, to point to him. Not something that we would make a contentious argument or something that we would worship or something that we would explain away so that it becomes just so not divine that we have a hard time reading why there was light on day 1 and then stars, moon, and sun on day 4. He would rather it point to him in simplicity. And in the same way, you and I think, are called to follow Jesus' example and say, we're simply reflecting something that's real and something that's true. In simplicity, with our days, with what we do, with our business, with our relationships, with our marriage, with our school, with the family that's around us. We just reflect the fact that light has come into the world and it penetrated us. And so now it moves through us. And in that, the more we do that, the more we restore and maintain the order that God put with that design in creation. Amen?